There I stood, blood beginning to boil, watching this woman in her spotless BMW wave a violation notice like she owned the world. The day Margaret Thornfield slapped me with a $200 0-cent fine for parking at my own cabin was also the day she handed me the keys to destroy her entire HOA empire. The metallic clang of her new gate rattled through the autumn air as she blocked my bridge. The same bridge my grieving grandfather built with his bare hands in 1943. Unauthorized vehicle storage, she declared, pointing at my truck parked on family land passed down through 3 generations. What Margaret didn't know, I owned the only bridge connecting her precious subdivision to civilization. Every single resident had to cross my property to reach their $400,000 0-cent homes. Are you dealing with a power-hungry HOA president right now? Comment below where you're watching from, because what happened next will make your revenge fantasies look like child's play. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. My name's Jake Morrison, I'm 34, and I'm a structural engineer who specializes in building bridges, which is going to be pretty important to this story. 2 years ago, my grandfather passed away and left me his 1,940s fishing cabin on Pine Lake. This wasn't just any cabin, it sits on 3 acres of pristine waterfront, accessed only by a single-lane bridge that crosses over Whisper Creek. Now, I travel a lot for work, building renewable energy projects overseas, so I barely got to visit the place. But that cabin? It meant everything to me. Grandpa taught me to fish from that dock, showed me how to identify every bird call echoing across the water, and spent countless evenings telling stories about building that bridge with his own hands back in 1943. The area around the cabin had changed dramatically in the past 5 years. What used to be quiet forest and farmland got turned into lakeside estates. One of those cookie-cutter subdivisions with houses that all look like they came from the same catalog. Nice enough, I guess, but not exactly the wilderness sanctuary Grandpa had envisioned. Enter Margaret Thornfield, 52 years old, moved from the city 3 years ago with dreams of becoming the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of standards. She got herself elected HOA president by promising to elevate property values and community standards, which apparently meant measuring people's grass with a ruler and timing how long their visitors stayed. Margaret drove a white BMW X7 that was always spotless, kept her nails perfectly manicured, and carried around this leather portfolio like she was closing million-dollar deals instead of hassling neighbors about their mailbox colors. She had this way of looking at my cabin, she'd call it, that rustic eyesore, when she thought I couldn't hear. The classism was subtle but unmistakable. So when I got back from a 6-month project in Denmark, imagine my surprise to find a brand new gate blocking the road to my bridge. Not just any gate, this thing was serious business, with concrete posts and a metallic clang that echoed through the trees every time it slammed shut. Margaret was waiting for me, portfolio in hand, with that expensive perfume that somehow managed to cut through the pine scent hanging in the air. She handed me an official-looking document claiming the bridge road was now community property, based on some recent surveyor report. According to her paperwork, road maintenance was the HOA's responsibility, which meant they controlled access. The violation notice was a work of art, $200 0 for unauthorized vehicle storage because my truck had been parked at the cabin, plus $50 0 for every day I didn't comply. The math was adding up fast. "I'm sure you understand," Margaret said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We simply can't have unauthorized vehicles cluttering our community roads. It's about property values, really." I ran my fingers along the rough concrete texture of those new gate posts, listening to the familiar sound of Whisper Creek babbling below the bridge. The whole situation felt surreal. This was the same bridge I'd crossed 1,000 times as a kid, the same creek where Grandpa taught me to skip stones. Most of the newer residents seemed to support Margaret's iron fist approach to community management. But the old-timers who remembered the area before the subdivision, they were quietly sympathetic. Betty Chen, a retired teacher who lived closest to the bridge, slipped me a note as I walked back to my truck. "Check the county records, something's fishy." As I drove away, gravel crunching under my tires, I was already planning my next move. See, Margaret had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was just another pushover resident who'd pay up and shut up. She had no idea she'd just picked a fight with someone who builds bridges for a living and who knew exactly what kind of paperwork goes into owning one. Margaret didn't waste any time escalating things. Within a week of our gate encounter, I got a cease and desist letter from some lawyer with a fancy letterhead. The legal language was designed to intimidate, claiming my continued trespassing was endangering children in the community, which was rich, considering no kids even lived near the bridge. The letter demanded I pay the accumulated fines, which had somehow ballooned to $450.00, or face immediate legal action for property damage and public endangerment. Margaret was also busy at the town coffee shop, spreading whispers about how I was unstable and making threats, neither of which was remotely true, but you know how small-town gossip works. I could have gotten angry. I could have stormed over to Margaret's perfect little house and had it out with her right there on her manicured lawn. Instead, I did what engineers do best. I gathered data. The county courthouse smelled like old paper and floor wax, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. I spent 3 hours digging through property records, running my fingers over aged parchment documents that felt smooth as silk from decades of handling. What I found there was absolutely beautiful. Grandpa's original 1943 property deed didn't just cover the cabin and the 3-acre lot. It specifically included ownership of the entire bridge structure, described in precise detail down to the type of timber used and the depth of the foundation pilings. The HOA's surveyor had done their homework on everything except the most important part. They'd conveniently omitted this crucial detail from their report. But here's where it gets interesting. The deed included something called an easement clause that required me to allow reasonable access to anyone needing to cross the bridge. Seemed fair enough. Grandpa was always a reasonable man. But the devil, as they say, is in the details. The clause specifically defined reasonable as no more than 12 vehicles per day. 12. The current Lakeside Estates subdivision has 47 homes, most with at least 2 cars. Do the math. Knowledge nugget time. Easement rights can be limited by the original deed specifications, and courts almost always uphold the specific language written by the original property owner. Always check the fine print. It's usually there for a reason. When I realized I basically controlled access to half the subdivision, I'll admit I smiled. But Margaret wasn't done yet. She escalated by installing a security camera pointed directly at my bridge, claiming it was for community safety monitoring. Then she started keeping a detailed log of my violations. Every time I crossed to my own property, she documented it like she was building a federal case. The woman even pressured other residents to sign a petition demanding I cooperate with community standards. Most people signed it just to get her to stop knocking on their doors. Margaret's teenage daughter was at one of these petition drives, and I swear that kid rolled her eyes so hard I worried she might need medical attention. But the community was starting to pay attention. Betty Chen whispered to me at the post office, with Whisper Creek babbling below us to mask our conversation, that Margaret had been asking questions about my finances. Apparently, she wanted to know if I could afford a legal fight. 3 longtime residents approached me privately over the next few days. Tom Hendricks, a Vietnam veteran who lived on the lake, told me Margaret had harassed him about his American flag being too large for community standards. Sarah Walsh, who worked for the local newspaper, mentioned that Margaret had tried to get her fired for writing an article about property rights. An elderly couple, the Kowalskis, shared how Margaret had forced them to remove bird feeders because they attracted undesirable wildlife. I was starting to understand this wasn't really about my bridge access. This was about a pattern of bullying that had been going on for months, and I'd just become the latest target. Margaret had turned our peaceful community into her personal kingdom, and she ruled it through fear and intimidation. The thing is, I'd dealt with petty tyrants before. Construction sites are full of people who think a little authority makes them Napoleon. But Margaret had made a critical error in judgment. She'd picked on someone who actually knew how to fight back, and more importantly, someone who had the patience to do it right. As I sat on my cabin porch that evening, listening to the loons call across the water, I realized this was bigger than just my access rights. If I let Margaret steamroll me, she'd keep doing it to other people. Someone had to make a stand. I just happened to be the guy with the bridge. Margaret's next move was pure financial warfare. She filed a complaint with the county claiming my bridge was structurally unsafe and demanded an expensive engineering inspection to the tune of $3,200.00. She rallied the HOA board to vote on an emergency assessment for community safety, and started spreading whispers around town that my overseas work was somehow suspicious. Apparently, building renewable energy projects in Denmark made me some kind of international man of mystery in Margaret's paranoid little world. But here's the thing about picking a fight with a bridge engineer over bridge safety. It's like challenging a chef to a cook-off in their own restaurant. I am a bridge engineer. I inspect bridges for a living. This particular bridge, I could assess it with my eyes closed. I spent a Saturday morning giving my grandfather's bridge the full professional treatment. Every joint, every support beam, every stress point got photographed and documented. The sound of my boots on those solid planks echoed across the water as I worked, and the familiar smell of creosote wood preservative brought back memories of helping Grandpa with maintenance when I was 12. What I found was beautiful in an engineering sense. Grandpa had overbuilt this bridge like he was expecting it to last until the next ice age. The thing was rated for 20 tons. It could handle a fire truck if necessary. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but notice that Margaret's own deck had several obvious code violations visible from the bridge approach. Knowledge nugget: a bridge rated for 20 tons can easily handle normal residential traffic, and you should always get a second opinion on any required inspections, especially from someone with actual expertise in the field. Margaret's desperation was showing. She attempted to get the town council to condemn my bridge as a public hazard, bringing along a petition she claimed had unanimous neighborhood support. Turns out half the signatures were forged, and the other half belonged to people who thought they were signing up for a community barbecue. When that failed, she filed a restraining order request, claiming I'd threatened her. Problem was, she had no witnesses because it never happened. The judge took one look at her evidence and basically laughed her out of court. But I wasn't just sitting around waiting for Margaret's next attack. I was doing my homework. I called 3 of the residents who'd supposedly signed her bridge petition. None of them had actually seen what they were signing. Margaret had shown up at their doors with a clipboard and some story about neighborhood improvements. Here's where it gets interesting. I live in a one-party consent state, which means I can legally record phone conversations without telling the other person. So when Margaret's lawyer called to negotiate, I hit record. 20 minutes into the conversation, that lawyer accidentally admitted they knew I owned the bridge, but were hoping I wouldn't fight it because most people don't understand property law. He actually said, and I quote, "Look, we're banking on this guy not knowing his rights." Wrong bet, counselor. My cat, Diesel, had become an unofficial judge of character during all this drama. That orange tabby would sit in the cabin window and hiss every time Margaret's BMW drove past. Even my cat knew something was off about this woman. The community was slowly waking up to what was really happening. Betty Chen revealed she was actually a retired paralegal and offered to help with legal research. Tom Hendricks shared his own expertise with bridge construction from his Army engineering days. Sarah Walsh, the local reporter, started asking pointed questions about HOA finances. We had our strategy sessions at Betty's kitchen table, and I'm telling you, the woman made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. During one of these meetings, Sarah brought up something interesting. The HOA's financial records were public, and Margaret had been spending money like she was running a small country instead of a neighborhood association. The evening loons were calling across the lake when Betty dropped the real bombshell. She'd found the HOA's budget reports, and they were spending almost twice their income. Margaret had approved a $40,000 0-cents landscaping project that basically amounted to some decorative boulders and a few shrubs. That's when I realized what this was really about. The HOA was desperate for new revenue, and they thought controlling my bridge would let them charge me monthly access fees. Margaret wasn't just power hungry, she was trying to solve a financial crisis by picking my pocket. The smell of fresh pine drifted through Betty's open kitchen window as we pored over documents, and I felt that familiar engineer's satisfaction when all the pieces of a complex problem finally start falling into place. Margaret had no idea what kind of storm she'd just created. Margaret's next move was straight-up sabotage. She hired a contractor to install what she called decorative barriers along the bridge approach. Concrete blocks positioned to look like landscaping but actually designed to prevent my truck from reaching the bridge. The grinding sound of the concrete saw at 7 in the morning woke up half the neighborhood, and the dust cloud hanging in the air looked like a small tornado had touched down. When I showed up to find my access completely blocked, Margaret was there with her clipboard, claiming it was a beautification project approved by the architectural committee. Funny thing about that committee, it consisted entirely of Margaret and 2 residents who did whatever she told them to avoid getting on her bad side. But Margaret had finally made a mistake I could use in court. I filed an emergency injunction to have those barriers removed, armed with my original bridge deed and a proper survey that clearly showed the approach road as part of my property. The judge was not amused. When Margaret tried to argue with His Honor about community standards and property values, he cut her off mid-sentence and ordered the barriers removed within 24 hours. Then he fined her $2,500 0 cents for contempt when she kept talking. Standing outside the courthouse, I took the opportunity to educate the small crowd that had gathered. Knowledge nugget. You can't block someone's legal access to their property. That's called landlocking, and it's illegal in all 50 states. Courts take property access rights very seriously, so document everything if someone tries to restrict your access. Margaret's retaliation was swift and predictable. She started a harassment campaign that would have made a middle school bully proud. Anonymous tips to county inspectors about safety violations at my cabin. Noise complaints about my truck, which visited exactly twice per month. She pressured HOA residents to shun me and anyone who supported me. The woman even tried to get my professional engineering license investigated, claiming I was mentally unstable and posed a threat to public safety. The state licensing board took one look at my record and essentially told her to stop wasting their time. But something interesting was happening in the community. Tom Hendricks organized what he called the Bridge Defense Committee, a group of residents who were fed up with Margaret's reign of terror. Betty Chin was using her paralegal skills to dig deeper into Margaret's background, and what she found was fascinating. Turned out Margaret had pulled similar stunts in her previous community before moving to Cedar Falls. She'd been involved in disputes with neighbors, filed frivolous lawsuits, and generally made life miserable for anyone who crossed her. The woman had a pattern. Sarah Walsh was doing her own investigation into the HOA's finances, and the numbers weren't adding up. There were irregular payments, mysterious consulting fees, and expenditures that didn't match any visible improvements to the community. Then, my homeowner's insurance agent dropped an interesting tidbit during a routine call. If anything happened to my bridge, if it was damaged or destroyed, the HOA residents would become landlocked too. Their property values would plummet without bridge access, and most insurance companies would refuse to cover properties that couldn't be reached by emergency vehicles. When I shared this revelation with the Bridge Defense Committee, you could practically hear the light bulbs clicking on. Margaret wasn't just harassing me, she was potentially destroying everyone's property values with her reckless behavior. Margaret must have sensed the tide turning because she called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she termed the Jake problem. Her PowerPoint presentation, complete with Comic Sans font, which made even her supporters cringe, proposed a special assessment to buy out my bridge rights for the insulting sum of $5,000 0 cents. A bridge that cost $200,000 0 cents to build today, and she wanted to pay me $5,000 for it. The audacity was breathtaking. The tension in the community was reaching a breaking point. Anonymous flyers started appearing around the neighborhood, calling me a community enemy. Someone left a nasty note on my truck windshield. Betty Chen's garden hose got mysteriously cut in the middle of the night. The coffee shop in town went dead silent whenever I walked in, with folks choosing sides and eyeing each other suspiciously. The peaceful community Grandpa had loved was turning into a war zone, and it was all because one woman couldn't accept that she didn't control everything and everyone around her. But I had patience, and I had facts on my side. Margaret was digging herself deeper with every desperate move she made. The question wasn't whether she'd hang herself with her own rope, it was how much damage she'd do to the community before it happened. As I sat on my bridge that evening, listening to Whisper Creek flowing steadily below, I realized the water had been flowing here long before Margaret arrived, and it would keep flowing long after she was gone. Some things are just bigger than petty tyrants and their delusions of power. Betty Chen called me at 6 a.m, her voice shaking with excitement. "Jake, you need to get over here right now. I found something huge in the HOA charter document." I drove over to her house with my coffee still steaming, and what she showed me changed everything. Buried in the original HOA charter was a clause that specifically stated existing property rights remain unchanged upon formation of this association. But here's the kicker. The HOA was formed in March 2023, 6 months after my grandfather passed away. Legal principle: you can't retroactively change property rights through private agreements formed after the fact. Margaret's entire legal strategy was built on quicksand. But Betty wasn't done. She'd also been digging into the HOA's financial records with the persistence of a bloodhound, and what she found made my coffee go cold. $23,000 was missing from the HOA reserve fund, with payments traced to something called Thornfield Consulting Service. Margaret had been embezzling from her own neighbors. Sarah Walsh confirmed it when she showed up an hour later with bank statements she'd obtained through a public records request. Margaret's personal consulting company had received regular payments from the HOA for services that apparently consisted of absolutely nothing. No contracts, no deliverables, no actual work product, just money flowing from the community fund straight into Margaret's pocket. My hands were trembling as I read through the documents, and it wasn't from the caffeine. This whole bridge fiasco had never been about community standards or property values. Margaret needed a distraction from her financial crimes, and I'd been the perfect scapegoat. An outsider who traveled for work, someone she could paint as a troublemaker while she systematically looted the HOA's funds. The power dynamic had just shifted completely. Margaret wasn't just a petty tyrant anymore, she was a criminal who'd been caught red-handed. And I was sitting on 3 devastating pieces of evidence: undisputable bridge ownership, proof of her harassment campaign, and now evidence of embezzlement. Knowledge nugget: when someone escalates a conflict unreasonably, start looking for what they're trying to hide. Bullies often attack to deflect attention from their own wrongdoing. Margaret's vulnerability was suddenly exposed like a nerve. Her lawyer had quietly withdrawn from the case, citing ethical concerns, which in lawyer speak means they'd figured out their client was guilty as sin. 2 HOA board members who'd been supporting her started distancing themselves. Even Margaret's husband was asking uncomfortable questions about their sudden financial improvements. The community whispers that had once focused on supporting Margaret's leadership were now questioning her motives. People started remembering things, like how she'd pushed through that expensive landscaping project without proper bids, or how she'd insisted on handling all financial matters personally instead of using the HOA's established accounting firm. I realized I could have pursued individual legal action and probably won a decent settlement, but this was bigger than my bridge access now. This was about protecting an entire community from a predator who'd been systematically stealing from her neighbors while bullying anyone who might question her authority. The sound of Whisper Creek flowing below my bridge had become my thinking music. That water was constant, patient, inevitable, wearing down obstacles through persistence rather than force. Margaret had underestimated the power of patience combined with facts. She was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between real authority and the kind that comes from fear and deception. With the truth about Margaret's embezzlement on the table, our little resistance group transformed into something much more serious. Betty Chen's kitchen became our war room, with the smell of fresh coffee mixing with the intensity of people who'd finally had enough of being pushed around. We mapped out our strategy like a military operation. Betty would handle all the legal research and documentation. Her paralegal training was worth its weight in gold. Tom Hendricks coordinated with other affected residents, using his natural leadership skills to build our coalition. Sarah Walsh prepared her investigative article, making sure every fact was bulletproof before publication. I called in a favor from a lawyer friend who agreed to guide our legal strategy pro bono. Turns out, when you have rock-solid evidence of embezzlement, attorneys get very interested in helping you out. Our legal strategy was 3-pronged. File a formal complaint with the State Attorney General for HOA fraud, demand a forensic audit of all HOA finances, and seek damages for harassment, defamation, and interference with property rights. We were also pushing for Margaret's immediate removal from the HOA board. But I wasn't just relying on lawyers. I put together a comprehensive bridge inspection report that would make the Army Corps of Engineers proud. Every stress calculation, every load-bearing analysis, every safety protocol was documented with professional photographs and detailed explanations. I even brought in a colleague from my engineering firm to provide independent verification. Knowledge nugget: HOA board members have fiduciary duties, meaning they're legally required to act in the community's best interest, not their own. Embezzlement from HOA funds is a felony in most states, and residents have the right to see all financial records, demand transparency. The technical preparation was crucial, but the real work was building community support. I visited every affected resident personally, explaining the situation without attacking Margaret's character. I let the facts speak for themselves. The response was overwhelming. People were angry about being manipulated, but they were angrier about being robbed. We built a coalition of 31 out of 47 homeowners. These weren't just signatures on a petition. These were people ready to stand up and be counted when things got tough. Tom's wife started bringing homemade cookies to our planning sessions, and she dubbed us the Bridge Club, which actually stuck. Diesel, my orange tabby, became our unofficial mascot, attending every meeting and providing moral support by purring loudly whenever we made progress. Betty's color-coded filing system was so thorough it would have impressed the FBI. Every document was cross-referenced, every timeline verified, every piece of evidence organized for maximum impact. The woman had missed her calling as a federal investigator. But Margaret wasn't sitting idle. She tried to spy on our activities, hiring a private investigator to find dirt on me. She spread rumors that our planning group was made up of conspiracy theorists trying to destroy the community. She even attempted to schedule a competing HOA meeting on the same night as the town hall we'd requested. Meanwhile, I was reaching out to my professional network. Engineering colleagues provided character references, previous clients sent testimonials about my integrity, my professional association confirmed my stellar reputation, even contacts from my international renewable energy work vouched for the legitimacy of my overseas projects. The trap we were setting was elegant in its simplicity. We were going to let Margaret hang herself at a public meeting with county officials and media present. I'd prepared questions that would force her to lie publicly, and Sarah Walsh had already alerted state fraud investigators about the embezzlement. The sound of papers rustling filled Betty's kitchen as we organized our evidence for maximum impact. We assigned speaking roles to different team members, prepared backup plans for Margaret's likely responses, and arranged media coverage to ensure accountability. The texture of those smooth bridge cables under my hands during evening inspections reminded me why I became an engineer in the first place. To build things that last, to solve problems that matter, to make communities stronger and safer. Margaret had spent months trying to tear down what my grandfather had built. Now it was time to show her what happens when you pick a fight with someone who builds bridges instead of burning them. As autumn leaves crunched under our feet during final preparations, I realized this had become about much more than property rights. This was about standing up to bullies, protecting communities from predators, and proving that regular people could fight back against corruption when they worked together. The loons were calling across Pine Lake as we finalized our plans, their voices echoing the same message that had been flowing under my bridge all along. Some things are worth fighting for, and patience, combined with truth, is an unstoppable force. Margaret was about to discover that the hard way. Margaret's desperation reached new heights when she tried to physically damage my bridge at 3 a.m. with a crowbar. The metallic scraping sounds and her heavy breathing were captured in crystal-clear audio by the security camera I'd installed after her earlier sabotage attempts. Watching that footage the next morning was surreal. There was the HOA president, this woman who lectured everyone about community standards, attacking private property like some kind of deranged vandal. The damage was minimal. Grandpa's bridge was built too well for a crowbar to do much harm, but the intent was clear as day. I filed a police report but didn't press charges immediately. Instead, I used the footage strategically, quietly sharing it with the remaining HOA board members who still had any sense left. The effect was immediate. 2 more board members resigned rather than be associated with Margaret's increasingly unhinged behavior. But Margaret wasn't done embarrassing herself. She launched a full-scale smear campaign using anonymous social media accounts to attack my reputation. Fake reviews of my engineering work started appearing online. Posts claiming I was dangerous and mentally unstable popped up on neighborhood Facebook groups. The cyberbullying was actually working against her. Knowledge nugget. Anonymous online attacks can be traced and prosecuted, and defamation is defamation whether it's spoken or posted online. Screenshot everything. Digital evidence disappears quickly, but screenshots are forever. The community was getting disgusted with Margaret's behavior. Her own neighbors started reporting suspicious late-night activity around her house. The support that had once propped up her reign of terror was evaporating faster than morning dew. Meanwhile, Betty Chen's banking contacts had uncovered something even more damaging. Margaret had attempted to take an emergency loan against the HOA reserves without proper board approval. When the bank refused, she'd forged board members' signatures on the loan documents. That's when I knew we had her completely. Embezzlement was bad enough, but forgery? That was federal crime territory. Margaret must have sensed the walls closing in because she made one last desperate play. She offered me a bribe. Called me up out of the blue, voice shaking, offering $15,000, 0 cents, to drop everything and move on. I recorded that conversation legally, and it was a gold mine. Margaret actually admitted she may have made mistakes with HOA funds. She accidentally confessed to other financial irregularities I hadn't even discovered yet. The woman was falling apart in real time. "Look, Jake," she said, her voice cracking, "maybe I got a little overzealous about community standards. Maybe some paperwork got mixed up, but we can work this out privately, can't we?" The community tension was reaching a breaking point. Some residents feared their property values would suffer from the scandal. Others were furious that they'd been paying HOA fees to fund Margaret's crimes. The once peaceful neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The uncomfortable silence at community gatherings was deafening. People chose sides in grocery store aisles. Former friends stopped speaking to each other. Margaret had managed to divide a community that had lived in harmony for years. But not everyone was fooled by her act. 3 more residents came forward with their own Margaret horror stories. Harassment, financial irregularities, and abuse of power that went back to her first year as HOA president. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Margaret's final threat was the most revealing of all. She called me one evening, completely unhinged, threatening to destroy my reputation if I didn't back down. She claimed she had connections who would ruin my career, and implied she'd fabricate safety violations on my bridge if I kept pushing. The woman was clearly detached from reality. She was facing criminal charges, had lost the support of her community, and her husband had moved out with the kids. Yet she still thought she could intimidate her way out of the mess she'd created. I documented every escalation methodically, building a timeline that showed Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior. My restraint and professionalism throughout the whole ordeal stood in stark contrast to her desperate thrashing. As I sat on my bridge that evening, listening to the water flow below and watching the stars reflect on Pine Lake's surface, I realized Margaret had become her own worst enemy. Every move she made to escape accountability just dug her hole deeper. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd started this whole thing to steal money and maintain power through fear. Now she was facing criminal prosecution and had destroyed her own reputation so thoroughly that she'd never hold authority over anyone again. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving your enemies enough rope to hang themselves. Margaret's final desperate act was calling county emergency services at 2 a.m, claiming my bridge was actively collapsing and posed an immediate threat to public safety. The sirens wailing through the quiet night woke up half the neighborhood, with fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency vehicles racing toward the bridge with diesel engines rumbling and radio chatter filling the air. I got the call from the fire chief at 2:47 a.m. "Jake, we've got reports of structural failure at your bridge. We need you down here to assess the situation." When I arrived, Margaret was standing there in her bathrobe, pointing dramatically at the bridge and claiming she'd heard cracking sounds that indicated imminent collapse. The fire chief, a no-nonsense guy named Captain Rodriguez, took one look at the perfectly solid bridge and then looked at me. "You're the engineer who built bridges overseas, right?" he asked. When I nodded, he said, "Mind taking a look and telling us what you think?" My professional examination took about 10 minutes. Every joint was solid, every support beam was exactly where it should be, and the structure was as sound as the day Grandpa finished building it. Captain Rodriguez watched me work, and when I gave him my assessment, he announced publicly that the bridge was safer than most county roads. Margaret's credibility died right there in front of a dozen witnesses. The fire chief didn't mince words. "Ma'am, filing false emergency reports is a crime. You've wasted taxpayer resources and endangered real emergencies by tying up our crews." But the real bombshell came the next morning when the state investigators finished their forensic audit of the HOA finances. The number was staggering: $31,000, 0 cents, in unexplained expenses, all traced back to Margaret's personal accounts through fake invoices for consulting services that never existed. Knowledge nugget. Every digital transaction leaves permanent records, and forensic accountants are like bloodhounds when it comes to following money trails. Embezzlement often starts small but escalates quickly when nobody's watching. Margaret's psychological breakdown was painful to watch. She started accusing random neighbors of being part of conspiracies against her. She left paranoid notes on people's doors, claiming Jake was part of some deep state plot to destroy suburban communities. Her husband had already moved out with the kids, and even her most loyal supporters were quietly backing away. But something beautiful was happening in the community. Residents organized a Bridge Appreciation Day, bringing picnics to eat near the bridge and celebrating the structure that connected their neighborhood. Kids drew chalk art on the bridge approaches, turning Margaret's symbol of division into something that brought people together. The media attention was incredible. Sarah Walsh's article got picked up by regional news stations, and the story went viral on social media with the hashtag #BridgeJustice. National HOA reform advocates started citing our case as a perfect example of what happens when petty tyrants get unchecked power. Margaret became a cautionary tale in property rights circles, the poster child for everything wrong with HOA culture. Her face was plastered across news websites as the HOA president who tried to steal a bridge. The legal consequences were mounting fast. The state attorney general filed criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. The HOA filed a civil lawsuit demanding restitution. Her real estate license was under review for professional misconduct. The IRS started asking uncomfortable questions about unreported income. As I sat on my bridge at sunset, processing everything that had happened, I realized this fight had never really been about me personally. I'd become a symbol of something bigger, the idea that ordinary people could stand up to petty tyranny and win. The evening birds were calling across the lake, and the peaceful silence felt like a benediction after months of conflict. Margaret had tried to turn my inheritance into her personal cash cow, but instead she'd awakened a community that refused to be bullied. Her final desperate act was attempting to flee town with the remaining HOA funds she could access, about $8,000, 0 cents in cash. Airport security stopped her at the gate, and the local news cameras captured her perp walk in all its pathetic glory. Standing there in handcuffs, her perfectly manicured image finally cracked. Margaret looked like what she'd always been underneath the expensive clothes and fake authority, just another small-time crook who'd gotten too greedy for her own good. The woman who'd spent months trying to destroy my reputation was now a national laughingstock, her own actions having accomplished what no enemy could have managed. She'd built her own prison out of lies, theft, and abuse of power. As the police car drove away with Margaret in the back seat, I couldn't help but think about Grandpa's bridge, still standing strong, still connecting communities, still serving its purpose, long after the person who tried to steal it had been forgotten. Some things are built to last, others are just built to fall. The town hall was packed beyond capacity. 200 people crammed into a space designed for maybe half that, with news cameras from 3 different stations and reporters taking notes in the back. The mayor had called this emergency meeting after Margaret's arrest made regional headlines, and everyone wanted to see how this community soap opera would end. I walked to the podium with my presentation materials, feeling remarkably calm for someone about to expose months of corruption in front of half the county. The visual aids were simple but devastating. A timeline of harassment, copies of the original bridge deed, and financial records showing exactly where the HOA's money had gone. Ladies and gentlemen, I began. 6 months ago, I thought I was dealing with an overzealous HOA president. What I discovered was systematic theft from your community funds, harassment of residents, and abuse of power that turned our neighborhood into a dictatorship. The room was dead silent as I walked through the evidence. Every harassment incident documented with photos and timestamps. Every financial irregularity traced through bank records. Every lie Margaret had told exposed with official documents that couldn't be disputed. Margaret sat in the front row, flanked by her court-appointed attorney and a county sheriff's deputy. She was technically out on bail, but her lawyer had advised her not to speak. That advice lasted about 5 minutes. When I played the recording of Margaret's bribery attempt where her own voice admitted to mistakes with HOA funds, Margaret jumped to her feet and started shouting accusations. "This is all a conspiracy. Jake orchestrated my financial problems. He's been planning this from the beginning." Her lawyer tried to pull her back down, but Margaret was beyond reason. She pointed wildly around the room, claiming everyone was out to get her, that I had somehow forced her to embezzle money and harass neighbors. The woman was having a complete psychological breakdown in front of 200 witnesses and 3 news cameras. "Mrs. Thornfield," the mayor interrupted, "you're out of order. Please sit down." "Out of order," Margaret screamed. "I'll show you what's out of order. This man has destroyed everything I worked to build in this community." That's when I delivered the line I'd been saving for this moment. "Margaret, the only thing you built in this community was a criminal enterprise funded by your neighbor's HOA fees. The only thing I destroyed was your ability to keep stealing from the people who trusted you." The crowd erupted in applause. Even some of Margaret's former supporters were clapping. Camera flashes illuminated the room as photographers captured the moment when a small-town tyrant finally got called out in public. Betty Chen took the microphone next, explaining how her legal research had exposed the fraudulent property claims. Tom Hendricks described the harassment campaign against veterans in the community. 3 other residents shared their own stories of Margaret's bullying tactics. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't about one dispute over bridge access. This was about a systematic pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. County Sheriff Martinez explained the criminal charges: embezzlement in the first degree, fraud, forgery, and filing false police reports. The state investigator outlined the ongoing case, mentioning that federal authorities were reviewing potential tax violations. The FBI representative confirmed they were looking into mail fraud charges related to the fake HOA documents. Judge Patterson, who was attending as a community member, announced the emergency restraining order that prohibited Margaret from HOA property or meetings. She was also required to surrender all HOA documents and any remaining funds in her possession. The media attention was intense. Reporters asked me about property rights advocacy. National HOA reform organizations contacted me about testifying before state legislatures. The story was trending on social media with thousands of comments from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Margaret's final humiliation came when Sheriff Martinez led her away in handcuffs while news cameras rolled. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood was now a cautionary tale broadcast across the region. Children who had once been afraid of her nasty glares waved goodbye as the police car pulled away. The community response was cathartic. People who hadn't spoken to each other in months were hugging and apologizing for letting the situation go on so long. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up were finally sharing their stories. The smell of coffee and nervous energy filled the packed room as residents began planning their community's recovery. Camera flashes continued popping as photographers documented not just Margaret's downfall, but the moment when a neighborhood decided to heal and move forward together. As the meeting ended and people filed out into the cool evening air, I felt a profound sense of closure. Grandpa's bridge had become more than just access to a cabin. It had become a symbol of standing up to bullies and protecting communities from predators. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a community had learned it could fight back. The transformation of our community was remarkable. Within 30 days, we'd elected a new HOA board with Betty Chen as president, chosen unanimously by residents who'd learned the hard way what happens when you give unchecked power to the wrong person. They asked me to serve on the board, but I politely declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. Margaret's legal troubles snowballed exactly as you'd expect. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud, receiving 2 years in prison and 5 years probation. The judge ordered her to pay $47,000, 0 cents in restitution, to the HOA, money that went toward fixing the financial mess she'd created. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, and her husband filed for divorce before she even got out on bail. But the real healing happened in the community itself. I organized the first annual Bridge Festival that October, exactly 1 year after Margaret had tried to block my access. Families brought picnics, kids played games on the bridge approaches, and we raised $8,000, 0 cents, for local veterans programs that Tom Hendricks recommended. The most meaningful moment came when Margaret's teenage daughter showed up with a handwritten apology letter. That kid had watched her mother's behavior with horror and wanted to make things right. She became the first recipient of the engineering scholarship fund I established, with donations from grateful community members. My personal life took an unexpected turn too. Instead of returning to overseas work, I decided to open an engineering consulting firm right here in Cedar Falls. Turns out there's a huge need for someone who specializes in helping small communities with infrastructure issues, and I'd found my calling in service rather than just profit. The property rights education website I created has helped dozens of other communities facing similar HOA tyranny. I've testified before 3 state legislatures about HOA reform, and the Cedar Falls case is now cited in legal textbooks as an example of how communities can fight back against corruption. The conservation initiative around the bridge became something Grandpa would have loved. We partnered with environmental groups to turn the area into a protected wildlife habitat, complete with educational programs about the local ecosystem. The bridge that Margaret tried to steal became a symbol of community stewardship and environmental protection. Property values in lakeside estates actually increased after the scandal, which surprised everyone except real estate professionals. Turns out buyers prefer communities that have proven they can handle corruption rather than places where it might still be lurking in the shadows. Sarah Walsh won a regional journalism award for her investigative reporting on HOA financial abuse. Betty Chin's systematic documentation methods are now taught in paralegal schools across the state. Tom Hendricks started a consulting service helping other communities organize against HOA abuse. The Bridge Defense Committee evolved into a permanent community advocacy group that helps residents navigate disputes and ensures transparent governance. They meet monthly at Betty's house, and yes, Diesel still attends every meeting as the official mascot. Margaret's former house became a community garden after the bank foreclosed. There's something poetic about vegetables growing where such toxicity once lived. Kids who were once afraid of her angry face now play among tomato plants and sunflowers. 6 months ago, a family moved to Cedar Falls specifically because they'd heard about our community's fight against corruption. They said they wanted to live somewhere that had proven it wouldn't tolerate bullies. That's when I knew we'd really won. The final statistics tell the story. HOA financial health restored within 6 months. 0 harassment complaints filed since Margaret's removal, and 12 other communities have contacted me for help with similar situations. The county declared Grandpa's bridge historically significant, ensuring it'll be protected for future generations. Looking back, I realized this was never really about bridge access or HOA fees. It was about whether ordinary people would stand up to petty tyrants who think authority gives them the right to steal and intimidate. Sometimes it takes one person willing to fight back to give everyone else permission to stop being afraid. As I write this, I can hear children's laughter echoing across the bridge during this year's festival. The smell of barbecue smoke mixes with fresh autumn air, and Old Glory flies proudly from the bridge tower. Grandpa's structure stands solid and enduring, just like the justice it came to represent. Now I want to hear from you. Share your own HOA nightmare stories in the comments below. You'd be amazed how many of these situations follow the same pattern. And if this story inspired you to stand up to bullies in your own community, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't believe what happened in the next town over.